Do you think you could survive a day as a medieval peasant? Give it a try. Modern society has accustomed us to comfort, instant access to information, and predictable lives. Our schedules are planned down to the hour, our homes shelter us from the elements, and food is readily available. We take these blessings for granted, rarely considering what life was like just a few centuries ago. My medieval village was a world where time flowed differently. Each day was a struggle for survival, and simple things we take for granted were unattainable luxuries. Daily life back then consisted of monotonous, exhausting labor from dawn till dusk. From building houses to preparing food, every aspect of life was filled with necessity and utility. After watching this video, you'll understand why an ordinary nail was once equivalent to silver, and how a simple household item could reveal a family's social status and wealth more than their clothes or home. Imagine a morning without an alarm clock. Your awakening doesn't depend on precise time, but on the morning light filtering through cracks in the walls or the persistent crowing of a rooster. Medieval peasants lived in a world where the concept of personally measurable time didn't exist. Their days were governed by the grand, natural clock. This internal biological rhythm, completely synchronized with the natural environment, shaped a worldview utterly different from ours. Time was cyclical, measured by the sun's position, the moon's phases, and the changing seasons. The only artificial reference point was the church bells. But even then, they didn't measure hours, they marked stages of life common to everyone, like signals for prayer or starting work. This sound wasn't a timer, it was the pulse of the community, synchronizing the actions of hundreds into a single flow. Essentially, there were two kinds of time: personal, natural time, and social time dictated by the church. The day was divided into simple, understandable segments: dawn, morning, noon, evening, sunset. These periods dictated the rhythm of work and rest, prayer and meals. No more precise division was needed, as the main task was to finish all work before dark. The sun was the primary overseer, its position in the sky determined the intensity and nature of labor. The concepts of hurry or being late held entirely different and much more significant meanings. They related more to seasonal farming tasks than to specific points in time. The cost of such mistakes wasn't measured in money, but in the threat of hunger for the entire family. Sowing at the wrong time meant risking losing seedlings. A delayed harvest meant the crop could be ruined by autumn rains. Success depended on the ability to perceive natural rhythms, not on following a schedule. The perception of distance was also entirely different. The world seemed both small and boundless. The distance to a neighboring village wasn't measured in kilometers, but by the time and effort required to walk there. Physical fatigue and the number of daylight hours were the primary measures of distance, making any journey a serious undertaking. A single trip to the market was an event in itself, requiring preparation and occupying the entire day. A peasant's world was limited to his village, fields, forest, and perhaps the nearest town. Everything outside this circle was a distant, almost mythical space, filled with the unknown. News from the outside world arrived weeks, or even months later, brought by rare merchants or pilgrims. These often multiply told pieces of information frequently turned into rumors and legends with tenuous connections to reality. This profound isolation shaped a unique worldview where the community played a key role. Everyone was visible, their conduct known to all. The very concept of a private life beyond the gaze of others simply didn't exist. The lack of personal space in the modern sense was compensated for by a constant sense of solidarity and collective responsibility. One's reputation in the eyes of neighbors was their most important asset. Every member of the community understood that their personal survival directly depended on everyone's coordinated actions. This interdependence wasn't a voluntary choice but a harsh necessity, the cornerstone of the entire social order. Helping a neighbor wasn't a good deed, it was an investment in one's own future. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this perception of time and space? Share your views in the comments. The peasant's workday began in the pre-Einiston mist, when the ground was still frozen with night chill. The awakening was sudden and devoid of comfort, instantly plunging one into a harsh reality. There was no time for a slow, groggy wake minus up, as every minute of daylight was irreplaceable. One's consciousness shook off sleep. It immediately focused on the most crucial task: lighting a warming fire in the hearth. This sacred ritual determined whether the entire household would have warmth, light, and hot food. This wasn't just a domestic rite, it was the fundamental act of beginning a new day. Without fire, the house was merely a cold, dark shelter, unfit for living. Thus, taming the flame was the primary duty of each morning. Starting a fire without matches was a true art, requiring immense patience and perfected movements. The main tools were a piece of hard flint and a steel striker, guarded like treasure. The success of the entire operation depended on the quality of tinder, a special material that could catch a single spark. Tinder was carefully stored and a dry place damp to ender was useless. With the swift, scraping motion of the striker against the flint, a shower of bright sparks was produced. At least one spark had to land on the tinder's surface, igniting a tiny flame. This skill was crucial and taught from childhood. The ability to start a fire quickly under any conditions was a primary indicator of maturity and homemaking ability. The secrets of this craft were passed down from father to son. Once the dry kindling caught fire, the single room of the peasant dwelling quickly filled with thick, acrid smoke that stung the eyes and made breathing difficult. That this was an unavoidable drawback that had to be endured. Only after some time would the smoke find its way out through a hole in the roof. The steady crackle of burning would become the signal for the rest of the household to rise. Women and children got up from their straw mattresses, shivering in the morning chill. Another long, arduous day of endless labor awaited them. The house was a living organism. It breathed unreacted to temperature changes. The precious heat provided by the hearth constantly tried to escape through numerous cracks in the walls. Therefore, preserving heat was as important as generating it. The cottage itself was the epitome of minimalism and functionality, built from the most readily available natural materials. Walls were often constructed using the wattle and daub technique, a wooden frame filled with a mixture of clay and straw. This structure was far from perfect, but provided necessary protection from wind and rain. The floor inside was earthen, simply carefully tamped down for smoothness. It was always cold and damp, so it was often covered with a layer of straw for warmth. The interior furnishings showed a complete absence of any hint of luxury or comfort. All the furniture consisted of a roughly nailed minus-together table and a few similarly crude benches. Sleeping arrangements were mattresses stuffed with hay, laid out on the floor or on wooden platforms at night. This was the entirety of a peasant family's possessions. The breakfast prepared by the woman over the burning hearth had nothing to do with enjoyment. Its sole primary purpose was to provide enough energy for the grueling labor ahead. The menu was monotonous, day after day, year after year. Most common was a simple porridge made from the cheapest, most available grains boiled in water. It could be barley, oats or millet, depending on the region and harvest. This food was nearly tasteless, but sufficiently high in calories to fuel hours of hard work. This morning meal wasn't a ritual, it was necessary fuel for the body. Every bite consumed was a guarantee of having enough strength to plow, sow, or mow. Therefore, food was approached with pragmatism, without expecting any culinary variety. The undisputed foundation of the entire diet was rye bread, almost revered as sacred, treated with immense respect, never allowing a single crumb to fall. Bread was a symbol of life, prosperity, and the peasant's toil. The process of making it was very long, requiring great effort primarily from women. First, grain had to be ground into flour using a heavy hand mill, then kneaded into a stiff dough. The bread was baked directly in the hot ashes of the hearth, and each loaf was of immense value. This simple meal was usually washed down with clean spring water if a source was nearby. Often, luminous alcohol, highly diluted beer or kvass served as the drink. These beverages were safer than water from some stagnant ponds. The brief breakfast was always eaten in focused silence. Time at dawn was too precious a resource to waste on chatter. Each family member silently ate their portion, mentally preparing for the day's tasks. After the meal, an unspoken but strict division of labor immediately took place. No commands or instructions were needed, as everyone, from the youngest to the oldest, knew their role in the family mechanism from childhood. This order was unshakable, ensuring the smooth running of the entire household. The men and adult sons picked up their simple tools, plow, sickle, axe, and without a word or delay, set off for work in the fields, the foundation of their existence. Their labor in the fields determined whether the family would have a harvest and food for winter. Women had equally hard and burdensome responsibilities in running the household. They were in charge of caring for the few livestock, keeping the hearth fire burning, and, of course, cooking. Additionally, they tended the vegetable garden, spun yarn, and sewed clothes. Thus, when the first rays of sun illuminated the earth, the never-ceasing conveyor belt of peasant labor began its. The cycle didn't stop for a moment until the deep dusk made work impossible. The peasant's life was entirely subordinated to this relentless rhythm. Every day was filled with countless chores concerning the survival of himself and his loved ones. What was the peasant's primary concern after opening his eyes? In the next chapter, we'll take a detailed look at those crucial tools that became extensions of his arms and were vital to his survival. The tools used by a medieval peasant were extremely simple, but the family's survival directly depended on their condition. Every item was the result of long, manual labor and held immense material value. These tools were made to serve not just one generation, so they were kept as the most precious possessions. Made from the most available materials, wood and iron, they were often passed down from father to son. A broken tool, or worse, a lost one, was a real tragedy for the entire family. After all, ordering a new plowshare or axe from the blacksmith required a significant portion of the harvest savings. The heavy wooden plow occupied a central place in field labor. Farming was unimaginable without it. Its design remained unchanged for centuries, consisting of a sturdy wooden frame and a small metal tip. This plowshare was the most valuable part of the plow, as iron was an expensive and scarce resource. Using such a primitive tool required astonishing physical strength and total concentration. The plow didn't turn the soil, it only cut a furrow, forcing the farmer to go over the same ground multiple times. Day after day, the man and his draft animal, be it ox or horse, became one unit in an exhausting effort. When harvest time came, the sickle and scythe became the main tools. The small sickle, with its characteristically curved blade, was used for harvesting precious grain crops. This work was meticulous and very slow, as the stalks had to be cut in small bunches. Every day during harvest, the peasant spent hours bent over under the hot sun, leading to severe back pain. Unlike the sickle, the scythe, with its long blade and handle, was used for cutting hay for winter fodder. Using a scythe required not precision, but wide, rhythmic swings and great physical endurance. The axe was rightfully considered the most versatile, indispensable tool in any peasant household. Was an extension of a man's arm, a faithful companion in the dense forest and constant construction work. With the axe, they chopped firewood for the hearth, felled trees for building huts, and repaired fences around the land. Proficiency with this tool was absolutely necessary for every man who wanted to feed his family. The axe's quality and durability depended directly on its metal part forged by the village blacksmith. This working part was expensive, mounted on a strong, comfortable handle usually made by the peasant himself. The peasant's workday was entirely dependent on the sun's path across the sky. It began with the first light of dawn in the east and ended only when deep dusk covered the land. The modern concept of weekends or holidays simply didn't exist, as every clear day was a precious gift for labor. The rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons, which had their immutable laws. Spring was a time of hope, hard plowing, and careful sowing, laying the foundation for future abundance. Summer was a time of monotonous weeding under the scorching sun and exhausting haymaking. Autumn brought the most intense period harvest, when all forces had to be mobilized to gather the crops. With winter's arrival, field work ceased, but this didn't mean rest. Peasants repaired worn tools, stockpiled firewood for the long months, and mended buildings damaged by harsh weather. The process of plowing was rightly considered one of the most physically demanding trials. The peasant and his draft animal were a single mechanical unit, moving slowly, unsteadily across the field. Controlling a team of oxen or a horse required constant attention and loud commands. The primitive plow only scratched the topsoil, forcing the same plot to be worked repeatedly. The plowshare often hit stones or roots, causing the entire structure to shake violently, requiring great effort from the plowman to steady it. A man pressed his full weight on the plow handles to ensure the furrow was straight and deep enough. A day's work behind the plow left the peasant utterly exhausted. Every muscle in his body ached from the inhuman strain, his hands covered in calluses. This work lasted for weeks, draining him of all strength, leaving no reserve. Once the field was prepared, it was time for sowing, done entirely by hand. The peasant walked across the plowed land with a heavy bag of carefully selected grain, seeds slung over his shoulder, the family's main hope. He made rhythmic movements honed by years of experience. The evenness of the seed distribution in the soil was crucial. Sowing too densely would make the plants crowd each other too sparsely, meant loss of part of the harvest. Therefore, this process required extreme concentration and an intuitive understanding. Every seed cast into the earth was strictly accounted for, as it was from the edible reserve. A sower's mistake might only become apparent months later, when it was too late to correct. Thus, a man carried on his shoulders the responsibility of feeding his family for the coming year. The harvest was the culmination of the entire agricultural year, a period of high tension and collective labor. The entire community, from teenagers to the elderly, went out to the fields, as every pair of hands was needed. The main ask was to gather the crop before the long autumn rains began. Everyone understood that delay or bad weather could instantly destroy months of work. Men and women worked from dawn till dusk with sickles, cutting stalks and binding them into sheaves. The air was filled with hope for a full winter, intertwined with fear of not finishing in time. Losing even a portion of the harvest meant the threat of hunger. Therefore, people worked to the limit of their strength, forgetting their fatigue. What emotions do you think a peasant felt looking at his field? In the next chapter, you'll learn what the house he lived in was like. The dwelling of a medieval peasant was built not for comfort, but for basic survival. Its main purpose was to provide shelter from the weather, wild animals, and the night's cold. Therefore, every element of the structure obeyed a strict logic of functionality and resource conservation. The most common was a simple one-room hut, built by the family themselves from materials available nearby. In forested areas, the main material was roughly hewn logs, stacked layer upon layer. In other regions, a wooden frame was erected and thickly plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and sometimes dung. This technique, known as wattle and daub, produced exceptionally sturdy and warm walls. The roof was usually covered with a thick layer of thatch or reeds, which provided good insulation. However, such a roof often leaked and required regular patching after heavy rain or snow. The interior of the house was almost always plunged into deep semi-darkness. This was because windows were deliberately made small and as sparse as possible. Any window opening was a source of significant heat loss, an unaffordable luxury in the cold season. Instead of expensive and hard -to obtained glass, more primitive materials were used. Windows might be covered with a piece of oiled cloth or carefully stretched and treated animal bladder. Such glass allowed only a small amount of dim light to pass through, but provided at least some protection from the wind. The only real source of lightened heat was the open hearth. It was placed in the center of the room, allowing heat to spread more or less evenly throughout the space. The whole family gathered around this fire in the evenings. It was the heart of their humble home. Since there was no chimney in the usual sense, all the smoke from the hearth rose upward. It slowly escaped through a special hole in the roof or simply seeped out through gaps in the thatch. Consequently, the air inside the room was thick, filled with acrid smoke and soot. Over time, all surfaces inside the house became covered with a thick layer of black, sticky soot. The ceiling beams, walls, and the few utensils took on a characteristic charred appearance. This aspect of daily life led to frequent respiratory ailments among all family members. The floor of the cottage was earthen, simply carefully tamped down hard. For a bit of insulation and basic hygiene, it was periodically covered with a fresh layer of straw. Sometimes, Dried herbs like wormwood or thyme worm mixed into the straw to add fragrance and repel insects. Without exception, the family's entire life was concentrated in this single room. There were no partitions, the space was transformed according to current needs. Breakfast was eaten here in the morning, women might spin yarn in the afternoon, and the family gathered for supper in the evening. The furniture was extremely sparse, consisting only of the most essential items. A roughly nailed table and several benches along the wall served both for eating and working. The most valuable possessions, if there were any, were kept in a large, locked wooden chest. At night, the same room became the shared bedroom for all family members. People slept on straw mattresses laid directly on the earthen floor or on wide wooden platforms lofts. During severe frosts, newborn lambs or calves were often brought inside for the night to prevent them from freezing. Although the primary and most visible work in the fields indeed fell on the men's shoulders, the women's work was equally arduous and absolutely indispensable. It consisted of a continuous cycle of duties unaffected by the seasons. While men's work was tied to the agricultural calendar, women's work did not stop for a single day. The peasant woman's duties began even before the first rays of sunlight illuminated the hut and did not end even after supper. She was the first to rise to light the hearth and the last to go to bed, ensuring everything was ready for the next day. Her duties encompassed all aspects of domestic life, from cooking to raising children. The woman was the keeper of the hearth, quite literally. Her diligence, knowledge, and physical endurance determined whether the family was fed, clothed, and healthy. This day, monotonous labor was the cornerstone of the entire peasant economy. One of the most physically demanding tasks was the daily preparation of food for a large family. The process began with fetching water from the nearest well or river, which had to be carried back in heavy wooden buckets. Then the hearth fire had to be lit and maintained, requiring skill and constant attention. For baking bread or cooking soup, flour had to be obtained from grain. This was done using a heavy hand mill, requiring hours of strenuous physical labor. Only then could the actual cooking begin, over an open fire and in clay pots. Additionally, women were responsible for preserving food for the long winter. They salted meat, dried mushrooms and berries, fermented cabbage and other vegetables. Their knowledge in this area allowed the family to survive the cold months when fresh food was nearly unavailable. Providing clothing for the family was also entirely the woman's domain. From processing the raw materials to sewing the final product, the entire process was done by hand. First, yarn had to be spun from wool or flax fibers using a spindle during long evenings. When enough yarn was ready, it was time to weave fabric on a primitive home loom. Even producing a few meters of coarse but durable cloth was a long, painstaking task. Old women sewed simple shirts, trousers, and dresses for all family members from this cloth. Mending clothing was an equally important part of her duties, as each garment was of great value. Old clothes were patched countless times, until they were completely worn out. Not a scrap of fabric was wasted, it was used for patches or rags. Besides household chores, women were responsible for the small vegetable garden next to the house. There she grew turnips, cabbages, onions, and other vegetables, an important supplement to the grain-based diet. Furthermore, she regularly went to the forest to gather wild berries, edible roots, and medicinal herbs. During the most critical periods of the agricultural year, women worked in the fields alongside the men. During sowing, they helped scatter seeds. During harvest, they worked with sickles from dawn till dusk. Without their participation, it was impossible to gather the crops in time before the rains came. Thus, women's labor, though less visible to outsiders, was vital for survival. They were cooks, weavers, seamstresses, gardeners, and heavers all in one. Which of the woman's duties do you think was the most difficult? In the next chapter, we'll talk about the peasant's relationships with the community and the Lord. A medieval peasant was never an isolated individual, as surviving alone was nearly impossible. He was an inseparable part of the village community, which functioned as a single, complex organism. This community dictated the rhythm of life and norms of behavior, subordinating personal interests to collective needs. Community life was based on strict, unwritten laws passed down through generations. The communal use of resources like pastures, forests, and water bodies required precise coordination among all members. For example, there were strict rules about when livestock could be grazed or when haymaking could begin. Any conflicts that arose, whether over boundaries or crop damage, were resolved within the community. The main institution was the assembly of household heads, where everyone could voice their opinion. The village elder, often the most respected and experienced man in the settlement, played a key role in resolving disputes. Legally, all the land the peasant farmed did not belong to him but to the feudal lord. The lord was the absolute master, and the peasant merely a holder of a small plot. For the right to live and work on this land, the peasant had to fulfill numerous obligations. The main and most burdensome form of servitude was corvée. This was compulsory labor, during which the peasant had to work several days a week on the lord's land. He had to use his own tools and draft animals, accelerating their wear and tear. The most fertile, best lands were usually designated as the lord's domain. The peasant was forced to work the lord's fields first, often to the detriment of his own. This meant he had much less time and energy left for his own farm. Besides labor service, there was another form of servitude: quit rent, or tax paid in kind. After the harvest, the peasant had to give a predetermined share of his crop to the lord. The amount of rent was determined entirely by the feudal lord and his steward. The best parts of the harvest went to the lord's granary: choice grain, vegetables, and fresh hay. Additionally, the rent often included other products from the farm: poultry, eggs, milk, honey, and homespun cloth. This levy was regular and unavoidable. Often the rent was set so high that after paying it, the peasant family was left with only the bare minimum of food to last until the next harvest, plus seed for sowing. Any year of poor harvest under such conditions could lead to real famine. The fate of an ordinary peasant was completely undoubtedly dependent on the will and mood of his master. The peasant was bound to the land and could not leave his native village without special permission. Attempting to flee was considered a serious crime, punishable severely. The peasant's personal life was also controlled. For example, he couldn't marry a girl from another village belonging to a different lord without the lord's consent. Such permission often required an additional ransom payment. The lord also held supreme judicial power over his lands. He adjudicated all disputes among his peasants and tried them for theft and other offenses. The lord could impose any punishment at his discretion, from fines to corporal punishment. His decision was final. The diet of a medieval peasant was a direct reflection of his dependent status and limited opportunities. It was characterized by extreme scarcity, monotony, and complete dependence on the whims of nature. Survival depended on what could be grown on his small plot of land. The main source of calories for hard physical labor was cereal crops. The foundation was hardy grains like rye, barley, and oats, which could grow in poor soil. Wheat, requiring more fertile land, was rare and considered a sign of prosperity. Everything that could be gathered from the surrounding for a storm, meadows, mushrooms, berries, and wild edible herbs served only as a meager supplement to the main diet. However, these gifts of nature were strictly seasonal and could not form the basis of sustenance. Bread occupied the central place on both the daily and holiday table. It was baked from coarsely ground rye flour, often with the bran not sifted out. In lean years, to increase the baking quantity, corns or even ground weeds might be mixed into the flour. Besides bread, grains were used for various porridges and soups, forming the basis of breakfast and supper. This was simple but filling food that allowed people to endure long workdays. Often, such soup was the only hot meal a peasant had all day. Meat was a true delicacy, appearing on the peasant's table only a few times a year. Usually, this happened during major church holidays like Christmas or Easter, when a pig might be slaughtered. At other times, meat consumption was extremely rare. Vegetables grown in the garden added some variety to the monotonous menu. The main crops peasants cultivated were the least demanding and most productive: turnips, cabbage, peas, beans, and various types of onions formed the basis of gardening. In summer and autumn, vegetables were eaten fresh or added to soups to make them thicker and more filling. However, the primary task was to preserve them for the long, hungry winter. The main preservation methods were salting, fermenting, and drying. Fruits, mainly wild or semi-minus cultivated apples, pears, and plums were only a seasonal treat. They were eaten fresh in late summer and autumn, but played no significant role in the overall diet. Keeping them fresh until winter was nearly impossible. Only families fortunate enough to own a cow, or at least a few goats, had access to dairy products. Milk was extremely precious, a source of much needed protein. It was rarely drunk fresh most often. It was processed into more storable products, simple cheeses and curds that could last a while. However, a significant portion of dairy products didn't make it to the peasant family's table, but went to the feudal lord's stores as rent or was sold at the nearest market. Fish could have been a good supplement to the diet, but its availability was limited. Even if the village was on a riverbank or lakeshore, fishing rights usually belonged to the lord. Often, peasants were forbidden to fish in the lord's waters under severe penalty. The material world of a medieval peasant was extremely limited, confined to the bare essentials. All his economic activity aimed at subsistence and fulfilling obligations, not at accumulating wealth. The idea of owning riches or beautiful objects was completely foreign and unattainable to him. Items that seem ordinary today, like glassware, metal cutlery, or mirrors, were true luxuries for a peasant. Their daily life had no ornamentation. The value of all objects lay solely in their practical use. Aesthetics played almost no role in their lives. The entire environment and possessions of a peasant family clearly reflected their position at the very bottom of the feudal hierarchy. The absence of anything superfluous was the norm. Anything not directly related to survival or labor was considered unnecessary. This minimalism was not a philosophical choice, but a harsh necessity of life. Peasant clothing was highly functional, designed to protect against the weather and hard work. Made from coarse but durable cloth produced by women at home. The main materials were linen grown on their own plaited wool from a few sheep. Thayer typically consisted of a long linen shirt worn loose and tied with a cord or belt. This was paired with simple trousers, and a thick woolen cloak was added in the cold season. Women wore a long ankle-length shirt, over which they put a sarafan or sleeveless dress. The range of clothing colors was very limited, as complex dyes were expensive and hard to obtain. The cloth retained its natural color, linen in grayish-white, wool in brown or white. The same garments were worn for years, constantly mended, and handed down to younger children in the family when outgrown. Wearing shoes constantly was a privilege of the wealthy, not the daily norm for a peasant. For most of the warm season from spring to late autumn, all family members went barefoot. Years of walking on the ground, stubble, and stones made the skin on their feet tough and calloused. In cold or wet weather and during heavy work in the forest, peasants wore the simplest footwear, perhaps poor shni primitive shoes made from a single piece of raw leather, fastened with straps. In some regions, wooden clogs were common, protecting the feet but very heavy. Any footwear, even the roughest, was considered a valuable item and cared for meticulously. Was uncomfortable, chafed, and didn't breathe well but provided necessary protection. Losing or damaging footwear was a serious problem, as making new shoes was not easy. Looking inside the cottage, aside from the simplest furniture and work tools, there were very few cooking utensils. On shelves, one might see several clay pots for cooking over the hearth. Wooden bowls and spoons were also used. Each man could carve them for his family himself. The only item for storage was a heavy, large wooden chest. It held the most valuable clothing, a small reserve of grain, and perhaps a few hand tools. The chest was often the only item in the house that could be locked, protecting the meager possessions from outsiders. Every item in the household, from the clay pot to the wooden spoon, was highly valued. Objects weren't bought in shops but created by family members through long, meticulous labor. Therefore, possessions were treated with such care, repaired as long as possible, and never discarded while still usable. When the last rays of sunlight disappeared below the horizon and the fields were enveloped in deep dusk, the hard labor stopped. Working in the dark was not only impossible but dangerous. So, the whole family slowly made their way home. This short journey from field to hut was the only transition from exhausting work to brief rest. The family returned to their only refuge, a dark, perpetually smoky, stuffy house. The woman immediately began preparing the meager supper, rekindling the hearth fire that had died down during the day. The men sat near the fire, using the last hours of daylight for important household tasks. By the dim light of the hearth, they carried out small but necessary repairs, ensuring readiness for the next day. One might fix a shovel handle, another sharpen a sickle blade, another weave simple bast shoes from tree bark. This quiet, focused work was as much a part of the evening as the meal itself. The composition of the peasant's supper differed little from breakfast or the midday meal. Most often, it was the same thick soup made from grains and vegetables left from noon, accompanied by the indispensable chunk of coarse rye bread, the foundation of the meal. These wax or tallow candles were an affordable luxuries reserved for the church or manor house. Therefore, the only source of light in the cottage was the flame burning in the hearth. By its dim, flickering glow, the family spent the short evening hours. The family ate in silence, huddled closely around the fire, which provided not only light but also precious warmth. The flickering flames cast strange shadows on the walls, creating the specific, quiet atmosphere that followed a day of toil. It was a moment to sit quietly and gather strength. The modern concept of entertainment simply didn't exist for a medieval peasant. Any activity had to have a practical purpose. Therefore, even leisure was tightly interwoven with work. On long, dark winter evenings, when there was no field work, people found occupations within the house. Men might spend hours carving useful wooden household items, spoons, bowls, children's toys. Women almost never put down their spindles, tirelessly spinning wool or flax thread. This monotonous work by the hearth light served as the backdrop for the rare family conversations. Sometimes, if not too tired, one of the elders might tell an old story or legend. Sometimes the family would softly hum long, sad songs passed down through generations. But more often than not, after a full day of physical labor, people had no energy left for talking or singing. As soon as supper was finished and the most urgent tasks completed, the family began preparing for sleep. They went to bed very early, almost immediately after sunset, following the natural rhythm. This was not only due to fatigue, but also the harsh necessity of conserving resources. Every log for the hearth was obtained through hard labor, so keeping a fire burning unnecessarily was considered wasteful. Sleep was the only completely free and available way to restore the strength expended during the day. It gave the body the necessary respite to face new challenges. And so, simple sleep on a straw mattress marked the end of a typical day for a medieval peasant. It was no different from the hundreds of days before and the hundreds to come, filled with the same scarcity. This endless cycle of hard labor, meager food, and brief rest constituted the very essence of his existence. We have now immersed ourselves in a day in the life of a medieval peasant. This reality, devoid of the comforts we are accustomed to, shows how much the world and our perception of life have changed. Work that for us is just a part of life was for them the very meaning of existence. The simple things we don't even notice were as precious as gold to them. Their world was harsh, but it had its own harmony, subordinated to the rhythms of nature. The ability to read the signs of the surrounding world, to understand the land and work in harmony with it, was key to survival. This experience, accumulated over generations, allowed our ancestors to survive the most difficult times and lay the foundation for the future in which we live now. What other eras or aspects of medieval life would you like to see in our future videos? Suggest your topics in the comments. Perhaps your idea will be the basis for the next episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new journeys into history. When winter descends on a medieval English castle, with cold, damp air seeping through the thick stone walls, the kitchen is the most important, and often the only truly warm place. The kitchen, the heart of the castle, where life boiled, culinary feats were forged, and the survival of hundreds was ensured, required a constant, reliable heat source. But without central heating and modern technology, how could it be kept hot enough to feed the entire castle and simultaneously warm its inhabitants? The secret to heating a castle kitchen is more complex than one might think, revealing astounding ingenuity and a deep understanding of thermal principles despite the lack of formal scientific knowledge. Get ready to learn about the unconventional methods and clever solutions that kept these massive structures functional and relatively comfortable even during the harshest frosts. We will reveal 10 surprising facts about how medieval castle kitchens kept warm, utilizing not only available resources but also unique architectural solutions. These facts will change your view of the supposedly simple Middle Ages, showing that behind the apparent primitive nest lay a true science of survival and engineering. 1. The giant hearth thermal hub and heat accumulator. The main heat source in a medieval castle kitchen was, of course, the enormous hearth. These massive structures, often several meters wide, deep, and high, were far more than just cooking spots. They acted as true thermal hubs, capable of heating large volumes of air and even transferring warmth to adjacent rooms. Unlike small fireplaces in private chambers meant for comfort or symbolic warmth, kitchen hearths were designed to sustain a large fire continuously and without interruption. Their enormous size wasn't just to accommodate several cauldrons holding food for hundreds and roasting spits simultaneously. It was to provide enough burning fuel to generate the massive amount of heat needed to sustain the entire kitchen. Often, these hearths were recesses built into thick walls, frequently with massive arched surrounds, which also helped accumulate heat. Their scale and structure allowed cooks to perform multiple cooking operations at once. Heavy cast iron, or bronze-heavy cast iron or bronze cauldrons hung on adjustable chains to directly over open flames. Whole animals from pigs to deer were slowly, unevenly roasted on manually turned, or even primitive mechanically driven. Large spits embers were rigged into specialized niches or placed under large earthenware pots, like a precursor to a Russian oven for baking bread, pies, and roasts. But the key was that these hearths were built from massive stone blocks like granite, sandstone, or limestone, which had a unique and extremely useful property for heating high thermal mass. Stone, as a dense material, slowly absorbed heat from the continuously burning flames during the kitchen's hours of active operation. Then, like a giant ceramic heater, it subsequently released the accumulated heat evenly into the surrounding kitchen area for hours, acting as a powerful radiant heat source. Thus, even after the most intensive cooking was done and the fire was banked down or purposefully kept smoldering until the next morning, the heavy, heat-soaked hearth walls continued to radiate warmth for hours, sometimes until the next dawn. This helped maintain a relatively comfortable temperature in the kitchen overnight when active cooking ceased, preventing the room from cooling completely. The hearth wasn't just a stove for cooking food, it was a constantly operating heat accumulator that smoothed out drastic temperature swings, provided basic room heating, and acted as the core of the entire thermal system of the castle kitchen. Its design considered not only the practical needs of cooking, but also the basic principles of heat retention and distribution, making it central to daily life and survival in the cold season. Cooks often slept in the kitchen or adjacent areas, utilizing the hearth's residual warmth to lay out natural convection and heat distribution. Unlike modern kitchens often designed as separate rooms with closed doors, castle kitchens, especially in large and early castles, typically featured an open floor plan or were connected to other rooms via wide, uninsulated arches and spacious corridors. This wasn't just an arbitrary architectural decision, but part of a carefully considered though intuitive system for distributing heat throughout the castle, maximizing the utility of thermal energy. The hot air constantly rising from the giant hearth naturally flowed upward and spread throughout the kitchen, and then, via these wide passages, could freely move into neighboring rooms like storerooms, bakehouses, servants' quarters, and sometimes even the lower hall, armory, or servants' dormitories located near the kitchen. This spatial arrangement created a thermal draft, or more accurately, a natural convection system. The warm, less dense air from the hot kitchen rose, forcing the cooler, denser air from adjacent rooms to move toward the kitchen, where it would then be heated and reciprocal. This constant air movement not only distributed heat but also promoted ventilation. While much of the heat was, of course, lost up the massive chimneys designed to efficiently remove smoke and soot, a significant portion was retained and accumulated in the castle's thick stone walls and ceilings, which also gradually but surely warmed up, becoming part of the castle's overall heating system. This was an intuitive application of basic thermodynamic principles, where the castle's very architecture facilitated passive heat distribution, turning it into a single large heat exchanger. Thus, the kitchen served not only as the culinary center for the entire castle, but also as a central thermal node from which heat gradually but consistently distributed throughout the building. Such a system allowed thermal energy to be used as efficiently as possible, not concentrated in just one room. Furthermore, the constant air movement caused by this convection helped reduce moisture buildup, odors, and even aided in drying walls in other parts of the castle, an important additional benefit under medieval living conditions where dampness was a constant companion. This interplay between functionality, hygiene, and heat exchange demonstrates a sophisticated approach to designing castle spaces, where every architectural element played multiple roles within a single, well-conceived system of survival and life support. This thoughtful planning provided more livable conditions for all the castle's inhabitants. 3. Stone construction, natural heat batteries. Castle kitchens, and indeed entire castles, were built of massive stone, the primary building material of the time. Now, although stone feels cold and uninviting to the touch, its high density and, crucially, its excellent thermal capacity were a major, indisputable advantage under conditions of passive heating. Imagine this throughout the day, as a huge fire blazed in the kitchen, generating vast amounts of heat during active cooking. The kitchen's thick stone walls, several meters thick, absorbed and accumulated this thermal energy. This process was slow and gradual, but steady and prolonged, turning all the surrounding walls into giant natural heat storage units. They acted like natural batteries, methodically absorbing excess heat. At night, when the fire in the hearth was banked down, maintained only by embers or extinguished completely, these heated stone walls began to slowly, unevenly radiate the accumulated heat back into the kitchen. This effect perfectly resembles modern central heating radiators or underfloor heating systems, but on a larger, passive and natural scale. Stone, as a massive heat reservoir, smoothed out drastic day-night temperature fluctuations, prevented the room from cooling rapidly, and maintained a relatively stable, comfortable temperature throughout the night. Such a system provided a baseline warmth that wouldn't drop to critical levels even during external blizzards. Thanks to this phenomenon of thermal inertia, the kitchen's working temperature could be maintained around the clock, albeit with some natural variation. The mass of the stone walls wasn't just a perimeter structure providing fortification and protection, it was an integral part of the heating system, operating passively and without additional fuel cost after the initial intense heating. This property of stone was key to maintaining the viability of the entire castle in the cold season, keeping it warm and functional even during moments when no active fire burned in the hearth. Medieval engineers, though unaware of modern scientific terms like thermal capacity or thermal conductivity, intuitively leveraged this advantage, observing material behavior and passing down accumulated experience through generations. Their practical knowledge allowed them to create structures effective against harsh climates, for body heat, human and animal biological heating. Medieval kitchen wasn't just a place for cooking, it was a seething cauldron of life, constantly filled with activity and motion. There were always many people present, from the key figure in the castle hierarchy, the head cook, to numerous assistants and simple servants, porters, woodcutters, and sometimes soldiers or guards, ensuring the security of such an important room. All these actively moving people, engaged in heavy physical labor like chopping and hauling massive logs for the hearth, carrying dozens of liters of water, constantly tending and maintaining the fire, washing vast quantities of vegetables, butchering large animals, released significant amounts of body heat. This was a form of biological heating, not a primary or intentional heat source, but one that contributed noticeably, unmeasurably to the room's overall thermal environment. In crowded conditions with intense physical exertion, the effect of hundreds of human calories being released into the air was tangible, helping to maintain the temperature. Furthermore, in some castles, especially in their earlier existence before specialized outbuildings developed during castles with simpler, more pragmatic organization, animals might be kept fairly close to the kitchen. Sometimes these were rooms for temporarily housing animals before slaughter, or even special pens for young livestock requiring constant warmth. The heat generated by animals, especially from large farm animals like pigs, cows, or sheep kept to supply the castle, could also contribute to raising the overall ambient temperature in adjacent areas. For example, if a pigsty or cowshed was located next to the kitchen complex, the body heat from the animals and the heat from their metabolic processes could transfer to the kitchen area through shared walls or airflow, creating an additional though indirect heat source. This was not only indirect, but a very real if not always controlled heat source that supplemented the primary heat from the hearth. It illustrates how in that era, every potential unit of energy, whether from human or animal bodies, was harnessed to endure the harsh medieval conditions. The crowding effect of people and possibly animals in and around the kitchen was significant, especially considering the room itself was poorly insulated by modern standards, making any extra thermal energy extremely precious. These living heat sources, combined with the massive stone structures that could accumulate heat, created a dynamic, multi-layered thermal regulation system where every element, even those not initially designed for heating, contributed to maintaining the relative comfort and functionality of the castle complex. 5. Clever ventilation, balancing heat and airflow. With such active cooking, constant use of open flames, burning large quantities of wood, and the presence of multiple hearths, a castle kitchen was inevitably filled with thick smoke, soot, saturated steam, strong odors from cooking food, and potentially dangerous carbon monoxide. However, medieval builders were not naive. They paid immense attention to creating effective ventilation and smoke extraction systems. Kitchen hearths usually had very tall and wide chimneys which, unlike simple smoke holes, not only served as channels for combustion products but also created powerful natural draft, much like modern industrial range hoods. Thanks to this design and large cross-sectional area, most of the smoke, soot, and harmful combustion products were efficiently expelled from the kitchen area, preventing smoke inhalation, soot buildup, and improving air quality for work. Additionally, besides the main chimney, there were often specialized ventilation holes or louvers high in the walls, just under the kitchen vault, as well as high windows which aided constant air circulation. These openings might be fitted with primitive dampers or shutters to regulate airflow. Properly designed ventilation not only provided fresh air and effectively reduced smoke crucial for staff health and efficiency, but also allowed flexible control over the room's temperature. In cold weather, the draft could be partially reduced by using these dampers or adjusting the opening sizes to retain more precious heat inside the kitchen. Conversely, during extreme heat, high humidity, or excessive smoke, the draft could be increased for more intensive air exchange, quickly removing excess heat and steam. This was a delicate but crucial game of airflow on one hand, the need to quickly and safely remove dangerous and unpleasant combustion products on the other, the need to prevent excessive heat loss which would cool the room. The skill of medieval engineers and builders lay precisely in their ability to balance these seemingly opposing tasks. They created a complex system that effectively controlled the kitchen's microclimate, preventing both overheating and excessive heat loss. Thus, chimneys and vents weren't just functional elements for smoke removal, they were parts of a sophisticated climate control system meticulously optimized for the complex, demanding conditions of a medieval castle kitchen. Their design was the result of centuries of practical experience and observation of fire and air behavior. 6. Metal utensils, portable radiators. Some medieval kitchens were literally stacked with enormous metal vessels and implements that played a role far beyond mere cooking containers. Here one could find huge cast iron cauldrons of various sizes from small portions to gigantic ones feeding hundreds, heavy iron frying pans, long wrought-iron spits for roasting meat over open flames, numerous clay pots and jugs often reinforced with metal bands for strength, and many other metal cooking tools and apparatus. Metal, especially cast iron commonly used for pots and pans, has exceptionally high thermal conductivity and significant heat capacity. This means it heats up quickly and retains heat for a long time. When these massive objects were heated over an open flame or in the hearth embers, They not only cooked food efficiently but also accumulated substantial thermal energy, which they then gradually and evenly radiated into the kitchen's surrounding area. Metal vessels heated to high temperatures after use, placed on the floor, on heavy stone tables, on special cooling racks, or simply piled against walls, acted like many small but very effective additional heat sources. These objects, like portable radiators, continued to actively transfer heat into the room long after being removed from the fire. For example, a large cast iron cauldron that had just been used to prepare food for the entire castle garrison could remain noticeably warm for hours, continuously emitting heat, contributing to maintaining the room's overall temperature, especially when the hearth fire was low. This was a form of stored heating, where every item used for cooking indirectly but significantly contributed to warming the room, making the kitchen warmer and more functional. The cumulative effect of many heated metal items constantly being used, heated, and moved around the kitchen was significant. Thus, even everyday kitchenware played a dual role. They were indispensable tools for cooking and also passive elements of the heating system. This underscores the pragmatism and resourcefulness of medieval life, where every detail, every material had its practical value and was maximized for multiple tasks, contributing to overall survival and comfort under castle living conditions. 7. Ash and embers. Ingenious use of secondary heat sources. The process of burning wood in the giant kitchen hearths left behind large quantities of hot ash and embers. Medieval cooks and servants didn't simply discard this combustion waste. They found numerous secondary uses for maintaining and distributing heat, demonstrating astonishing resourcefulness. This wasn't just utilization, it was a purposeful strategy to maximize every unit of energy generated. Hot ash, as an excellent insulator and heat retainer, could be used to heat stone benches, seats, or even sections of the floor in certain areas of the kitchen where staff rested or performed less active work. For example, it could be spread under thick stone slabs to create a kind of warmed floor or heated surface that retained warmth for a long time. In the absence of modern central heating, this significantly increased comfort. Imagine a stone kitchen in a castle during winter. A seat cold. Any opportunity to create a local heat source was extremely precious. Slowly cooling ash would radiate heat for hours, making it an ideal energy storage medium. Furthermore, ash was often used to maintain optimal temperatures during fermentation processes or for simmering certain dishes. Earthenware pots containing stewed meat or porridge could be buried in hot ash to ensure even, long cooking at a low, stable temperature, preventing burning and preserving all the flavors of the ingredients. This was a medieval way of using residual heat for slow cooking. Sometimes, ash was mixed with water to make lye, which was then used for washing, cleaning, and making soap. Thus, even the chemical potential of ash was utilized, showing a deep understanding of material properties. Embers were particularly valuable. They were often scooped from the main hearth into smaller, portable braziers, fire pans, or lidded clay pots, which were then placed in areas of the kitchen needing localized warmth. These mobile heat sources could be used to keep food warm before serving, crucial for dish quality, especially in large castles where the journey from kitchen to hall could be quite long. Additionally, braziers were used to dry wet clothes or warm the hands and feet of cooks working in cooler areas. During harsh winters when castle temperatures could drop very low, such personal heat sources were vital for maintaining staff efficiency and health. Moreover, these braziers could be moved as needed to other parts of the castle with insufficient heating, such as storerooms, servants' quarters, or even, if necessary, to the lord's private chambers, providing temporary, localized warmth. This allowed for creating comfort zones in any part of the castle as needed, without having to maintain a constant fire in every room. For example, in bed chambers, braziers were used to warm beds before retiring. For medical purposes, the heat from embers could be used to warm limbs or prepare herbal infusions. The versatility of ember use demonstrates the flexibility of medieval heat management systems. These mobile batteries were symbols of adaptability and ingenuity, allowing thermal energy to be distributed throughout the castle to meet changing demands. It was an extremely efficient way to get the maximum possible use out of every piece of fuel, extracting the greatest thermal energy from it, and demonstrating an attitude of extreme resource conservation. Thus, Even what is considered waste today was a valuable resource for maintaining comfort and functionality in the castle environment. This effectiveness stemmed not only from fuel scarcity, but also from deep empirical knowledge of material properties. The use of ash not only provided warmth, but also maintained hygiene, as ash is absorbent and can be used to eliminate odors. This highlights the pragmatism and ingenuity inherent in medieval society, which couldn't afford the luxury of waste and instead sought to extract maximum benefit from every available resource. It was a real life example of a circular economy long before the term was coined. 8 adjacent heat sources synergy with bakehouses, etc. Castle kitchens were usually located in close proximity to other rooms whose activities also generated significant heat. First and foremost were bakehouses, often either immediately adjacent to the kitchen or integrated into the kitchen complex. This layout was an accidental but the result of careful planning and functionality. The massive stone ovens used for baking bread, pies, and other baked goods required long, intense heating to very high temperatures. Lighting such an oven could take hours, and once it reached the required temperature, it retained heat for a long time, cooling slowly. When these ovens were heated and operating at full capacity, they radiated enormous heat, which inevitably seeped into the rooms adjacent to the kitchen through shared walls and doorways. Thus, the kitchen received a powerful additional heat source from the neighboring bakehouse, creating a kind of heat cluster or synergistic effect. This significantly reduced the thermal load on the main kitchen hearth, as part of the necessary heat came from an external source. The bakehouse's operation not only supplied the castle with fresh bread, the foundation of the diet, but also helped heat the kitchen space, reduce the overall load on the main kitchen hearth, and saved precious fuel. In the context of a medieval castle, where logistics and supply were complex tasks, any resource saving was significant. This demonstrates a deep understanding of the basic principles of heat transfer and energy efficiency, long before the formulation of related scientific laws. Sometimes, other warm production facilities might also be located nearby, such as a brewery where fermentation processes took place. Fermentation itself is an exothermic reaction that generates heat, and the entire brewing process requires maintaining specific temperatures for water and wort. The proximity of a brewery could provide an additional, though less intense supply of heat. There might also be special food storage rooms that needed to be kept at a certain, not minus to minus low temperature to prevent spoilage, especially in winter. For example, some vegetables, fruits, and even meats required moderately cool but non-minus freezing conditions for long minus term storage. Heat from the bakehouse and kitchen could help keep storerooms stable above freezing. This was an accidental but a well-considered architectural solution that allowed for the synergistic use of heat from different production processes for overall heating, reducing the need for additional fuel and enhancing the effect of the main hearth. This spatial organization optimized heat flow within the castle, demonstrating a profound understanding of energy efficiency long before the term was introduced. It also minimized the movement of hot products and raw materials, improving safety and efficiency. In the absence of centralized heating, such localized heating centers were the only way to maintain functionality and comfort during cold months. Placing various heat-generating functions next to each other was crucial for creating a self-sufficient and warm system in winter, providing comfort not only for the staff but also optimal conditions for cooking and storing food, vital for the survival of the castle's inhabitants. This is an example of an integrated design approach that considers multiple interrelated factors. Hang wooden ceilings insulating barrier for heat. Although castles are primarily associated with massive stone structures, heavy wooden beams and ceilings were actively used in many kitchens and adjacent rooms. Wooden beams, rafters. This might seem contradictory given the fire risk, but wood was deliberately chosen for its unique insulating properties. Unlike stone, which is a much better thermal insulator, it conducts heat much more slowly, meaning the heat rising from the hot hearth stayed in the lower, working area of the room longer and didn't escape as quickly through the ceiling or to upper floors. Evil builders understood this thermodynamic principle intuitively, The thick wooden floors and the massive beams supporting them helped create a kind of thermal dome or heat trap above the kitchen workspace. This design effectively prevented the rapid rise and dissipation of hot air. The high ceilings characteristic of many castle kitchens, combined with wooden floors, created an air buffer layer that further improved insulation. Additionally, various natural insulating materials like straw, clay moss, and even dried leaves and twigs might be stuffed into the gaps between beams and within the fourth thickness itself. These materials, rich in air pockets, further enhance the ceiling's insulating properties, reducing heat loss to the upper floors, attics, or unused spaces above the kitchen. The use of these readily available, cheap materials demonstrates the pragmatism and resourcefulness of medieval builders. It was a simple yet extremely effective solution that leveraged the natural properties of available materials to retain precious heat where it was needed. The combination of heat minus accumulating stone walls which warmed slowly and released heat over time with insulating wooden ceilings, which prevented heat from moving upward, quickly created a balanced system that helped to maintain a stable temperature for longer periods. Stone walls acted as heat storage, while wooden ceilings acted as a heat barrier. Wood also helped absorb excess moisture from the air, which contributed to a more comfortable microclimate in the kitchen. Despite the constant use of water and steam, and the moisture generated from boiling water and cooking food, which could be problematic, wood helped regulate humidity, preventing condensation and mold formation. Besides insulation, the wooden beams served a structural purpose, supporting the upper floors and ensuring the overall strength of the structure. Their thickness and density also helped with sound insulation, important in a busy kitchen space. Aesthetic factors played a role too. Exposed wooden beams gave the kitchen interior a special character and recalled the craftsmanship of medieval artisans. Thus, the wooden ceiling was a multifunctional element that not only helped retain heat, but also enhanced the overall functionality and comfort of the castle space. This highlights an integrated architectural approach where every element performed multiple tasks. 10 chimneys had unvertical radiators. The chimneys of a castle kitchen weren't merely vertical channels for expelling smoke and combustion products. They were massive stone built shafts passing through the thickness of the castle walls and towering above the roof. This was a complex engineering structure requiring significant labor and materials. While the fireplace hearth was in operation, the smoke and extremely hot air rising up these wide, tall chimneys transferred a substantial portion of their heat to the stone walls of the chimney itself. These walls, sometimes several feet thick, acted as giant heat storage tanks. These heated, multi-ton stone chimney masses in turn radiated the stored heat into the rooms surrounding the chimney flue. This was a form of concealed heating, or passive heat exchange, where the chimney, as an integral part of the exhaust system, also acted as an invisible radiator, radiating heat into adjacent corridors, storerooms, service rooms, and even some living quarters along its path. Often, the taller the chimney, the more rooms it could deliver residual warmth to, functioning as a kind of vertical heating system. This was especially valuable for rooms that lacked their own hearths, but needed minimal heating to maintain comfort or protect property. Thus, even heat originally intended to be expelled with the smoke was partially utilized for heating castle rooms, significantly increasing the overall energy efficiency of the castle. This demonstrates the remarkable pragmatism and engineering wisdom of medieval architecture, where every element performed multiple functions, maximizing resource utility. The chimney, beyond its primary task of purifying air, removing smoke and soot, was an integral component of the castle's thermal system, helping to smooth out temperature variations and especially in cold weather maintain a relatively warm climate within the massive stone structure. This was particularly important given that castle walls made of stone were excellent at keeping out external cold. Designing a chimney required deep knowledge in aerodynamics and thermal engineering based on centuries of experience. The chimney's size, shape, and location were optimized to ensure effective draft and maximum heat output. Sometimes special protrusions or expansions were created inside the flue to increase the contact surface area between the hot smoke and the stone, thereby increasing heat exchange accordingly. Furthermore, chimney placement was often designed so that it passed through the central, most frequently used parts of the castle, delivering heat precisely where it was most needed. This not only improved comfort, but also helped prevent dampness and mold on walls within the massive stone structure, a common problem in medieval architecture. Overall, the chimney was not just part of the ventilation system, but an integrated component of the castle's complex and efficient heat management system. As we've seen, heating the medieval English castle kitchen wasn't just a matter of lighting a fire, it was a complex, multifaceted system based on an intuitive understanding of physical principles and the clever use of available materials. The giant hearth as a heat accumulator, the thick stone walls absorbing unradiating heat, the ingenious ventilation system regulating airflow, harnessing heat from neighboring production areas, and even the body heat of people all work together to turn the kitchen into the true thermal heart of the castle, sustaining its viability. These 10 facts only scratch the surface of the astonishing ingenuity of medieval people, who were able to create relatively comfortable living conditions in harsh circumstances without modern technology. Their methods were deeply embedded in architecture and daily life, demonstrating remarkable adaptability and efficiency. They were masters of survival and engineering for their time, skillfully leveraging every available resource. If you enjoyed this dive into history and want to learn more unusual facts about medieval life, please subscribe to our channel. We will continue to uncover the secrets of the past and show you just how inventive our ancestors were.